Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're really privileged today to be joined by a terrific professor and thought leader in the United States, Molly Worthen. Molly is a native. Let me tell you a little bit about Molly. She's a native of Illinois, grew up in Glen Ellen, went on to study at Yale as both an undergraduate and a PhD, developing a specialty in American religiosity. She's had this terrific career in academia. She's designed a great course for the Great Courses program. She's also developed a course for Audible. She's the author of three books. The one that we are going to talk about in some detail today is called Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. It's really important and interesting book. And so we're going to talk about that at some length. She's also written two other books. One is called The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost: The Grand Strategy of Charles Hill, about one of her professors at Yale. And actually, I read that book, and it was how I first was introduced to Molly some years ago. And then she's also written a book called Apostles of Reason: The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelism. So a lot to talk about. This is obviously an interesting time to talk about leadership and charisma. And so we're really delighted that Molly is joining us from her office in North Carolina. So good morning, Molly.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, I need to start out with your Illinois roots. I know you grew up in Glen Ellen, a suburb of Chicago. Tell us a little bit about that. And also, you're telling me that you had a trip to Carbondale for a forensics contest that was kind of formative in your life. So tell us a little bit about your Illinois roots.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up in Glen Ellen, which is about 20 miles west of the city, and a huge part of my formative high school experience was being on the speech team and doing a range of public speaking events. And I believe it was my junior year, the state tournament was down in Carbondale, and I have powerful memories of noticing all the cultural differences between the Chicago area and Southern Illinois, like the different kinds of pop in the machine. It's the first time I ever saw a Surge, which was a very obscure soda to me, and I was like, wow, I'm in a different part of the country right now, but it was terrific.
Great, great. And then tell us a little bit about how you decided to go to Yale and your experience there. Was that the school you always sort of had your eyes on as you were going through high school in Illinois?
As a high school student, I was always just focused on the next thing right in front of me and didn't give a ton of thought to college. I had a vague notion of wanting to go out east somewhere. And then after I got into Yale, I visited it. I fell in love with the campus. Had a great experience there as an undergraduate, and then ended up sticking around. I got some financial support to turn my senior thesis that I wrote as an undergraduate into my first book, the biography of the kind of behind the scenes diplomat, Charlie Hill. And then when I finished that, I wanted to return to what was really my first love intellectually, which was the study of religious history, and ended up getting into the PhD program there. And so stayed there also for my graduate work, and really still feel a lot of fondness for New Haven for having spent all that formative time there.
Right. Well, you were part of a program that's very much discussed at Yale called the Grand Strategy Program. In fact, we had a terrific conversation a couple years ago with John Gaddis, and we talked a little bit about the program with him. So you, in fact, in one writing, one article, you said you referred to the course. You said it has its own myth. And it's very selective. Only about 20 students, I think, are allowed in each year. Many more apply. So tell us about both that program and how it has shaped you in the, say, subsequent 20 years of your career.
I'm glad to hear you had John Gaddis on. He was a really important mentor for me. The Grand Strategy program began right around the time I started at Yale in 1999, and it was very unusual in that it was a team taught course. John taught it along with the historian of modern British diplomatic history, Paul Kennedy, and then Charlie Hill, this former Foreign Service officer who I ended up writing about. And this was the late 90s, early 2000s, this sort of really interesting post-Cold War moment when I think those three professors looked around and they had contacts in the highest reaches of the policy world, and they were struck by the tendency of policymakers to focus on kind of fine-grained technocratic matters and not see the forest for the trees, and the way in which many in Washington were kind of casting about in this era, after the end of the Cold War, which of course had framed, that was sort of the moral and ideological, paradigm, the big picture paradigm for so much of, conversations about America's purpose, what our foreign and domestic policy should really be focused on. And now that, there was sort of no overarching frame. And, Francis Fukuyama is publishing his article and then book about how we're at the end of history and all that needs doing is just the sorting out of fine, technocratic matters. And so this course grant strategy was a kind of countercultural entry into that conversation, I think responding to a need for both kind of to expose students to on the ground challenges in the actual work of governance and foreign affairs, but with an eye to the grand tradition of big picture strategic thinking going back to Sun Tzu and Thucydides. And of course, very early in the history of the program is 9/11. And that completely, changes the framework, I think, and the questions certainly students are asking. This was true for me. I was a junior in college when that happened. And so this program has evolved since then. I mean, half the year, it's a year-long program, and half of it traditionally has been focused to reading big books. And then students have some sort of formative summer internship or research experience. And then there's a more practically oriented, sort of case study based final semester. Although the original three professors retired some years ago, Charlie died in 2011. So the program has changed, and with different faculty come different priorities. But I think that basic paradigm remains the same.
Well, someone who has written a biography of a living person, I've done it in two cases. It is a really, really daunting task, and I wonder how your experience was with your former professor. Because as I've read your book, I recall reading it. I mean, he was this astonishing professor, but he was not of the warm and uh, cozy. I mean, he was sort of tough love, stern, challenging. What was it like to write a book about a former professor?
Part of his mystique was exactly as you describe. He was pretty laconic. His students knew that he had this sort of mysterious history that had placed him behind the scenes at all these fascinating points in post-war American diplomatic history. He'd been a China watcher based in Hong Kong in the early 60s. He had served in Saigon, right at the end of American involvement there. He'd been a speechwriter for Henry Kissinger. During the Reagan years, he was second in command in the State Department, essentially the kind of right-hand man to the Secretary of State, George Shultz. And Charlie would sort of drop breadcrumbs about this career, but not tell you enough to answer your questions. And he did. I mean, he had a kind of a following, but I would say he was very polarizing. You either loved him or hated him. He was famous for giving, unsolicited advice that was often very, very countercultural. He would, tell the average Yale student to not go to law school and not go work for McKinsey, right? He had just different vision for what life was about. But he took me very seriously from the moment I began approaching him to just say, can we do some interviews? I'm just writing this final paper for a class. And in retrospect, I think he always sensed it was going to be a bigger project. But the great gift he gave me as a teacher, and something I think a lot about now that I'm a professor myself, is that gift of taking me much more seriously than I took myself as I mean, gosh, 17, 18, 19-year-old, I guess. And it was really through writing his story, doing all of these hours of oral history interviews. But then it turned out he had this enormous archive. He had kept contemporaneous verbatim notes on every conversation he had seen or been a part of, especially during the Reagan years. And those notes had been classified in the course of the Iran-Contra investigation. So the originals had never been used by scholars, but it turned out that he had made clandestine photocopies that he decided to let me use. So I was really finding my footing as a historian. He offered essentially to be my guinea pig, and at the same time, I was learning that my mentor, who I had idolized all through undergrad, is a normal, flawed human. I mean, in the course of doing this biography, I became friends with his ex-wife, and who also was from Chicago. She was from Oak Park, and we kind of bonded over that. And nothing will change your view of a man like getting to know his ex-wife, and also just kind of coming to some criticisms of certain decisions he'd made in his career, and then coming out on the other side, still full of incredible admiration and affection for him, but a much more, I think, a more mature form of that. And Charlie never read the book. He never read the biography. He died in 2011 or 2021, and I believe he never read it. And I'm glad for it. I think no matter how scrupulously correct I got it, and I'm sure I made mistakes, uh, anyone is going to have objections to the way someone else tells their life story. And Charlie he was fascinated by the human condition. He was a generalist in his interests. And so once I had moved on to kind of return to the study of religion, he was always really eager to talk about what I was researching. And so we just continued that really rich intellectual relationship after I'd finished the biography.
Okay, great. Well, just a word about your teaching at North Carolina. I've looked at just some of the course offerings that you teach, and it's really interesting array from history of religion in North America, God and government in America, sin and evil in modern America, humans and the cosmos. Tell us just a bit about your teaching work at North Carolina, the focus of it, grads and undergrads, anything you might want to share.
My main expertise is history of religion and politics and ideas generally, mostly in the North American context. So, yeah, right. This semester, I'm teaching a big lecture course called God and Government in America, which it tries to trace the story of the interrelation between religion and politics in mainly the US, with some attention to Canada, from the European contact to the present. I'm teaching a course this semester called Sin and Evil in Modern America, which is a research seminar. Undergraduates are experts on sins of all kinds, right? So we spent the first part of the semester reading a range of books from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time to Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem. We read Dorothy Day's memoir, The Long Loneliness, just to begin to develop a sense of the wide range of ways in which Americans from the late 19th century to the present have wrestled with concepts of evil and sin and suffering. And then the second half of the term, students are launched on their own research project where they can pursue their own interests. And then I've done some collaborative team teaching through an interdisciplinary team teaching program that my university has. And so that Humans in the Cosmos class is a class that I teach with an expert on German philosophy and literature and a computational physicist. And so that's a lot of fun.
Well, I read an essay you wrote in which you were somewhat self-deprecating. You said, initially, when I began teaching, I wanted to be a cool teacher, but then I quickly decided that no, I'm not trying to be a cool teacher. I'm willing to be a bit of an old fogey. Talk a little bit about what that means. I mean, just sort of a kind of return. Well, let me just leave it at that.
I think this especially applies to the way I see higher ed too frequently rushing to embrace anything that can be cast as innovation, especially when it comes to the techniques we use in the classroom and the embrace of technology. I think it's important for universities While of course, in certain parts of their research mission and certain parts of how we prepare students, we do need to be focused on the latest technological changes. That's fine. However, that always has to be balanced with what I think is the university's abiding countercultural mission. And I mean counterculture, not in any ideological sense, but it's in simply the sense that we are a place to nurture and sustain practices and disciplines that don't necessarily have an immediate reward, by the sort of metrics of Wall Street or what have you. But there is a practical aim in that, and so this has come to the fore in my teaching life, mainly in technology, and I become more of an anti-tech fundamentalist every semester. But I think it is such a mistake to think that if we throw these 18-year-olds, into 100% use of, every form of AI and, having them do, the sort of, reading excerpts of documents on a screen and never, touching a book between two covers. And we think that at the other end, they will emerge from our institutions as fully formed, mature thinkers who can use the technology rather than be used by it. I think that's a huge mistake. And what I see more and more is that our students are sensing that. I mean, they sense that something is deeply wrong in their totally attenuated attention spans, in the fact that many of them come to us and have never read a book. I mean, maybe they read Harry Potter, but they're the product of K through 12 systems shaped so profoundly by Common Core and No Child Left Behind and this pressure that our teachers are under to teach to the test, that they are very rarely now asked to read full-length texts. It's all excerpts. And they are, I think, really, it's not lost on them that the mental health crisis has spiked at the same time that they have become so tethered to their, glowing rectangles, and that is the great mediator of their social contact. So every semester I become more and more analog. I mean, this semester I told my students, guys, we're just going to pretend it's the 1990s and it's going to be great. So they have to put their phones and all screens away from the moment they cross the threshold into the classroom. I've been trying to strip all use of PDFs and things from my syllabus and just assign as much as possible text, documents that are published that they can have between two covers or full-length books. And been surprised by, maybe there's a little bit of grumbling. They can't use their laptops to take notes. They've got to do it by hand. And this is something that they didn't learn in many cases in high school. So I have to teach them that. But I get a lot of unsolicited comments from students saying that they really appreciate it and how amazing it is to have, a 70-minute island, twice a week in the course of their week, when they just have to pay attention to one thing at a time. So I'm cautiously hopeful that we're beginning to see a cultural turn, and that maybe I and my colleagues who take this attitude, and there are growing numbers of us, we won't be we won't feel like the embattled counterculture maybe it has seemed like we are sometimes.
Great, very interesting. Well, Molly, let's talk about charisma. I know you've been working on this terrific book for about a decade, and I want to read a couple sentences and then just have you expand. You describe charisma as a relationship between leader and follower. It reflects the human need to explain and control unseen forces and the power of an all-encompassing, empowering story to make people do things for the storyteller. And the sort of two pieces I want you to maybe develop is just the notion of charisma as a relationship, and also the relationship, the importance of a story or a narrative as part of this relationship.
Part of why I took on this project is because of the fuzziness of the term charisma. I mean, it seems to me that it's a word that we use in everyday speech. We often punt to the word charisma when we are observing a dynamic between a leader and followers that we don't quite understand. We can't rationalize it by pointing to, some deal that the leader is offering. It doesn't make sense to us. And so we use this word. But part of so I was partly on a quest to kind of figure it out and also tease apart what I think is the intertwined story between charisma in the original theological New Testament sense of the word, in which it means a supernatural, unbidden gift from God that brings with it some kind of power, and the way we use the term in colloquial speech, which we owe to the German sociologist Max Weber, who around the turn of the 20th century borrowed the word from the world of the New Testament and church history and kind of repurposed it to describe a kind of authority, a relationship between leader and followers that is premised on an authority distinct from the authority that comes with, say, a leader's role in an institution or relationship to tradition or having a big military behind you. And from that kind of upper echelon of academic sociology, the word sort of leached into our speech, right? And I think at the beginning of the project, I was confused. I tended to confuse charisma with charm. I thought in the course of this research, I would be learning about a lot of really charming people, people with high emotional intelligence, really good at working the room. They would all be great orators, I thought. And that showed up here and there, but it was not the pattern of things. The broader pattern was that these leaders were all deeply polarizing. I think charismatic leaders tend to have a lot of people who love them and a lot of people who find them repulsive, and not many who are just lukewarm. Then the other thing I was wrestling with is the way in which charisma seemed able to travel. I mean, yes, there would be occasions where followers might have a powerful in-person encounter at a political rally or a religious revival, but so often that was not the case. And a big turning point for me was learning more about the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and learning about Joseph Smith's role in that. On the one hand, discovering that he was deeply polarizing. And you can find firsthand accounts that dwell on how good looking he was. He was very tall for the time. He had these, vivid blue eyes. One follower, early convert, talks about shaking his hand and feeling the Holy Spirit electrify her from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. But you can find just as many, if not more, firsthand accounts from skeptics who said, this guy is a clown. Why would anyone follow him? He has these like weird kind of fat hands. That was actually something I found in one of the documents. It was a fixation for one person who met him. So what's going on there, right? And then another piece of information I was trying to make sense of is the fact that in the early years of the church, you have a significant number of converts. I mean, over 1,400 people converting to the Mormon faith in the United Kingdom. So, never having met Joseph Smith, this is after their encounters with missionaries, reading the Book of Mormon. And these are people in the late 1830s, around 1840, who make the decision to shut down their lives in England and move across the Atlantic to this tiny town on the banks of the Mississippi, Nauvoo, Illinois, to devote their lives to this new vision of the world. And in that case, it cannot be, right? It can't be the the interpersonal magnetism of Smith, because these folks had never met him. So that helped me zero in on the power of the story. The leader is important. But to me, the heart of the charismatic relationship is the leader's ability to invite potential followers into a new transcendent story that gives followers a new picture of what the chaos and suffering in their life means and how their own individual story connects to this bigger picture that gives them a sense of ultimate meaning and is somehow more compelling than the other stories on offer in the culture. And I think our reaction to charismatic leaders has everything to do with our relationship to that story. So if the leader is offering you an attractive role, I think you're inclined to be intrigued by this person and drawn in. If, on the other hand, he or she is casting you as a villain or seems to just write you out entirely, I think you are likely to be quite repulsed. And so that helped me pull together some of these otherwise confusing features of these mass political and religious movements.
Another intriguing notion you introduce, and I'll introduce it by quoting you. You say, charismatic leaders often turn up and people decide to follow out of a desperate response to alienation and injustice. People in anguish seek a savior. Yet charisma doesn't have a fixed moral standing. It can carve a path to freedom or enslavement. It can lead people to embrace the rule of law or sneer at it. So talk, if you would, Molly, about the important piece. And you also say alienation is charisma's most flammable tinder. So talk about how alienation is part of this relationship.
There's no period in American history that is totally without charismatic leaders. And I think that speaks to the fact that there are always subcultures. There are subsets of our society who are frustrated, disillusioned with the stories on offer from mainstream culture, mainstream institutions. But I think there's a reason why charismatic leaders seem to become more numerous. They gain more purchase on culture at times of broad national crisis, because that's a time when a kind of critical mass of people are casting about for a new way to understand. So I learned a lot from studying the career of the Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey, who shows up in Harlem. He's from Jamaica originally in about 1916, having founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association with a new story, a new pitch to African Americans, casting them as a race really specially chosen by God, who is called by God to sort of recover their original identity as this empowered group of people destined to reclaim the African continent and really reclaim a much sort of prouder vision of who they are, separate and apart from white culture, from any kind of pluralistic vision of American culture. And there is, this period of just a few years in which, I mean, this is the biggest mass movement of African descended people worldwide, in history up until this point. And Garvey is leading these incredible parades. He had such an instinct for the way, returning African American World War I veterans, having had the experience of kind of the dignity of uniform and fighting for democracy, and then they come home and they're hit in the face with the realities of Jim Crow and segregation in the North as well. He had an instinct for the power of ritual and regalia and how it could lift you up out of the indignities of kind of everyday American life to be in a role very much on display in the context of these parades or rallies. But the movement kind of quickly flames out because of persecution and, well, I should say negative attention on the part of federal authorities who get kind of nervous about Marcus Garvey and arrest him on charges of mail fraud, and he's imprisoned and then pardoned and deported. And so it can be easy to sort of see it as this anomalous episode that has a short life. But I think what we see is that part of the story of Garvey and his movement is that the broader the brewing crisis of the 1920s and the Great Depression that hits American and really, global, the global scene a few years later had in some ways devastated African Americans earlier. They were suffering, because of, the kind of economic circumstances, especially in the middle parts of the country, droughts and flooding in the Mississippi Delta, both. There were ways in which, the resonance of Marcus Garvey and his particular critique of institutions, it really captured, that subculture of America early. And then we see actually an echo of, some of the broad features of his, and I cast him as a kind of agitator. That's the type, the charismatic type that he embodies. We see echoes of that on the national stage, reaching a much broader audience. For example, in the career in the late 20s and the early 1930s of the great Louisiana populist Huey Long, who is not, his story, his pitch to potential followers is, of course, not one of kind of pan-African, it's not a racialized vision, but it's a vision of how, you Americans down and out have been betrayed by these institutions. You've been told this story of how you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But in fact, that has proven to be a lie. And the New Deal is not radical enough. And we need a kind of radical change and threat to institutions to really alleviate the suffering of the Great Depression. So there's a way in which smaller communities that are under particular kinds of pressure, they can give us a window into what might be coming as some of these historical developments mature into really much broader crises.
Well, Molly, let's walk through briefly the five types of charismatic leaders. And let me just mention a type, and then you could tell maybe a bit about it and maybe an exemplar. I mean, the first one you talk about is the prophet.
Charismatic leaders are almost always they define themselves and they generate a lot of their energy through strategic opposition to tradition and institutions. The prophet is the type I trace, from earliest European contact to really the kind of middle, late colonial period. And prophets are anti-institutional in a sense, but operating in a culture in which there is still a high level of literacy, knowledge, fidelity to these institutions. So they have to take that into account when making a play for authority. I open the book with the story of the great Puritan Massachusetts Bay heretic Anne Hutchinson, who meddles with this careful balance that the Puritan clergy and magistrates have developed between, on the one hand, affirming a high vision of God's sovereignty, a vision of predestination in which God has decided before the beginning of creation whether you are damned or among the elect, and yet also needing to persuade people that there are certain things you can do, you can prepare yourself for the occasion when maybe you will hear this calling from God. There are features of a sanctified life that ought to be proof, evidence that you are among the elect. All of these sort of rules that seek to make this new fragile community governable. And Anne Hutchinson enters into this and says, you are telling people they can earn their salvation, and that's not what we believe. And in fact, Christians should be able to hear directly from the Holy Spirit, mediated through Scripture. And of course, she's a woman saying this at a time when women are definitely not preaching from the pulpit and are not seen as trustworthy bearers of this kind of message. But she's an early indicator in a pattern we see throughout the history of charismatic leaders, in which a play for charisma, whether it's a story I'm pitching directly to would-be followers, or charisma in that New Testament sense of claiming that is a common end run around worldly hierarchy and authority that has had a special appeal and power to groups of people who because of their gender or their race, their socioeconomic status, the kind of eccentricity of their ideas, they don't have access to those institutions. And so, it is the prophetic era is this era of some chaos, of a sort of a kind of fracturing and recreation of old world traditions and ideas and theology in this new world context, which is a kind of not a totally free, but a relatively free market of religion and spirituality in a way totally without precedent in the Western world or really anywhere.
The second type you refer to is the conquerors. What do you mean by that?
Part of what I'm trying to capture is I think there is a kind of pendulum swing across American history when Americans are emerging from an era of some chaos and tearing down. Prophets tend to tear down. They have more of an appetite for building, for order. And in the early national period, that is what I'm trying to capture in this type, the conqueror. And in that, I mean, I'm referring to both kind of literal military state building conqueror types like Andrew Jackson, like Napoleon Bonaparte, who has this, I mean, the kind of long shadow of his celebrity. And although, Americans have a sort of ambivalent view of him, right, as he becomes more and more imperial, still, he is the standard in many ways by which, against whom they evaluate so many of their own statesmen. But I also mean conqueror in the sense of metaphysical conqueror, in the sense of the American appetite for a story that sort of links the conquest of the continent by European descended Americans with the conquest and a picture of eternal progress in the hereafter, in the supernatural realm. So some of my major characters in this part of the book include spiritualist trance speakers who are generally young women who believe and they convince audiences that they have this gift of being a medium to the spirit world. And they, can walk into a crowded lecture hall and give a lecture, ostensibly simply turning their vocal cords over to some higher power from the spirit world. Sometimes a famous statesman. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was apparently a very popular guest at seances, and he would appear in these trance lectures, passing on his guidance from beyond the grave. And spiritualists saw what they were doing as not, sort of woo-woo spiritual religious heretical dabbling. They saw it actually as the cutting edge of science. I mean, remember that this is a time when leading scientists are just beginning to formulate what become the kind of modern understandings of the theory of magnetism and electricity. People like James Clerk Maxwell in the UK in the 1860s. And this idea, right, that actually so much of our world is governed by these invisible powers that, if you know the kind of secret workings of them, you can begin to manipulate them. I think it's actually not hard when I put it that way to see how many Americans might connect this with other ways of thinking about the supernatural, and see actually the work of these spiritualists in developing methods for connecting to spirits beyond the grave as part of the advance of human understanding of the universe, and also part of they are reacting against the kind of traditional Christian vision of humans as broken, as depraved by original sin, as needing salvation to save them from hell. For spiritualists, it's all a story of eternal progress. There is no kind of need for salvation. There's no original sin. And I'll say too that Joseph Smith and the Mormons are part of this story of metaphysical conquest, and part of this kind of theological reimagining of what it means to be a new country. As for them, their vision of spreading this new faith and evangelizing was totally intertwined with a vision of kingdom building, but also bringing this message to indigenous Americans. Joseph Smith believed that the ancestors of living Native Americans were this ancient Semitic people the Lamanites who figure in the Book of Mormon. And so the initial generation of Mormons were very focused on converting Native Americans and alerting them to their divine destiny as a chosen people who, once they kind of join forces with the Mormons, would reclaim this role that they have in God's picture of American history. So it really is one of theological and worldly conquest.
What you had mentioned the third one, the agitators. If you wanted to comment on that, but also the next one, experts, which sort of takes us a little bit closer to our current circumstances. So maybe agitators and experts.
Yeah, I will tell you how they're intertwined. I mean, the agitator par excellence of that era, which is an era that I trace from the late 19th century to the end of World War II, is Adolf Hitler. And he becomes in his genocidal tearing down of all of the values of Judeo-Christian Western civilization, he becomes this terrifying lesson to academics, journalists, I think Americans at large, on the dangers of charisma, unchecked by checks and balances of institutions and the rule of law. And coming out of World War II, many commentators essentially say, okay, if that's what charisma looks like, it just murderous demagoguery, it has no place in modern Western democratic society. We are turning away from that mode of leadership. And so it's really interesting. In the 50s and 60s, you see political scientists continuing to comment on charismatic leadership in the global South, in newly independent African countries, societies they see as not as modernized. But they generally turn away from seeing it in America. And as a result, or rather in kind of as part of this, from 1945 to about 1965, we see an anomalous period in American history. This is the one period in which it's the expert technocrats who have charisma, whose story about the future of America, about all the advantages that come with trusting expertise to run the wars of the country and advance science and get us to the moon, spread democracy, raise the standard of living. This is persuasive to a huge swath of Americans because otherwise, when I zoom out on American history, I think the through line is of Americans' attitudes toward elite experts is generally one of deep ambivalence. I mean, there are moments of respect for that kind of knowledge and leadership, but also a lot of skepticism. And this period from 45 to 65 is really kind of exceptional. And so I found myself writing about people in that period that I would not expect would show up in History of Charisma. I ended up writing quite a lot about Adlai Stevenson, who your Illinois audience, must appreciate. And what I have to recognize in myself, here I am, I'm a nerdy historian, and maybe I'm guilty of a little bit of nostalgia for Adlai Stevenson myself, right? Like, there's no greater vacation from our current moment of sort of denatured populist internet drivel and polarized politics than to just spend an afternoon reading the speeches of Adlai Stevenson. Just so reasonable, calling us to the best vision of our rational selves, right? But I do think that his role is kind of underappreciated in that he pioneered, perhaps in more exaggerated form, this picture of the statesman intellectual that was perhaps he was too professorial, but he pioneered a way of being a politician in the world of ideas and claiming the authority of academia that John F. Kennedy then adapted and combined with his other the other narratives of, right, his narrative as a war hero and the kind of glamour of Camelot and all of that. And even though in the, in the substance of the Kennedy administration's New Frontier, I mean, many of those ideas and the way his administration pitched its story to the country, I think a lot of that borrowed heavily from some of what Adlai Stevenson developed when he was, running against Dwight Eisenhower, the sort of most difficult political task one could imagine in the 1950s. So it's a period of, relative authority accrued by universities and institutions, but it's not one that lasts forever because it sets us up for the era I believe we're currently in, which I call the era of the gurus.
Well, one thing I want to touch on just before we go to the gurus is I was thinking about the charisma of experts, and I was recalling I teach a class I mentioned to you on statesmanship, and we do one section on George Marshall. And in my course, my research, I came across a Dean Acheson, who was his successor and actually had worked for Marshall. Shortly after Marshall died, Acheson wrote a tribute to him in the New Yorker. And I want to read two sentences to just sort of play off this theme you're developing. And this is what Acheson writes. He says, "The moment General Marshall entered a room, everyone in it felt his presence. It was a striking and communicated force. His figure conveyed intensity, which his voice, low, staccato, and incisive, reinforced. It compelled respect. It spread a sense of authority and calm. There was no military glamour about him and nothing of the martinet."
Hmm. That's that's so interesting.
And
And and
it led me to kind of think about the notion of charisma, sort of competence as a kind of charisma. And the notion that maybe someone like a George Washington or a Marshall or an Eisenhower were not particularly great at words to develop a story and a vision. Their actions sort of told the story that brought people in.
and I think all three are examples of leaders with tremendous respect for institutions and rules and understood the need for the leader himself to submit to institutions and rules, which I think is a crucial. Well, it's one way we can tell the difference between a leader who uses the power of charismatic relationship building for moral progress and a leader who uses it to propel society in the other direction. This question of does the leader himself does he insist that he is the final authority, right? Or does he submit? And so I mean I think that is I wonder if that's part of what is captured in that quotation you read. It's not just about Marshall's body language or tone of voice, but it's a way he was able to convey to his subordinates a sense of the gravity of their duties. And duties that did not emerge fully formed out of the mind of one leader, but duties that have to do with preserving institutions and preserving the rule of law.
Right. Interesting. Well, let's talk about the category gurus. We've talked for about 40 minutes without mentioning the name of either Barack Obama or Donald Trump, particularly President Trump. So, talk to us about your notion of gurus.
Gurus, in some ways, echo some of these patterns that we see in earlier phases of American history, in these earlier charismatic types who are generally destroyers, who tear things down. So the gurus have a lot in common with the prophets and the agitators, but they are emboldened and empowered in a new way because they are operating in a time of really unprecedented institutional weakness. So my book is in some ways a story, a narrative of what happens to the human religious impulse as traditional institutions of organized religion decline. But I am also seeking to redefine that whole story, which people often summarize with the word secularization, as a story that's not just about the decline of churches, but it's about the decline of the authority of institutions in general. And I think we're all familiar with the poll data. Americans are at a really historic level of distrust of institutions ranging from the federal government to the mainstream media to universities. And this is, I think, a dynamic that gains even more momentum in our internet, social media age, when we have this illusion that we can just sort of sit on our couch and scroll our way to an understanding of the world that is surely more trustworthy than what the experts of a previous era would give us. But it's a false picture, and we know more and more about the way in which algorithms, guide us into these echo chambers where we are perhaps more likely than ever in the past to become persuaded by the story of a particular leader and not have the tools or the resources to really check the story he is telling against countervailing pictures of the world. You mentioned Barack Obama. He's not someone I write about at length in the book, partly just because you can't write about everyone you want to write about. But I wish I had been able to, in part because I think Obama was sort of this last gasp of, in part, the charisma of expertise. I mean, he's someone who could channel that kind of optimism in the institutions of the country, and he could, when he wanted to, lean into a kind of professorial bearing he had, and yet it was extra powerful because of the way he could combine it with really a prophetic presence of drawing especially on the Black Protestant prophetic tradition. But I think in some ways the success of his two elections, I mean, it perhaps blinded many of his supporters to the really anemic state of the institutions of democracy, in the minds of many Americans. Many Americans were just in a much more cynical place, and turned out to be really compelled by the kind of next wave of leaders, especially Donald Trump, who came offering a very different story about how the whole system is rigged and you can't trust, experts or institutions, and Washington is a swamp. And you have been sealed from true reality by this sort of progressive set of demands about speaking in a politically correct way, and letting historically oppressed groups jump the queue, right, and gain social advantages that they have not earned, right. This is the narrative, and it's one that Trump very expertly, I mean, he really began weaving a version of it from his earliest appearances in the tabloids in New York in 1980. If you go back and read, his interviews and his early books, it's very much it's quite an amazing project of sort of personal myth building, as himself as this sort of entrepreneur genius who has built this empire, against all odds, while all these sort of evil parties have been trying to screw him over. And it's one that he could kind of easily transfer to a version of freedom fighter on behalf of the little guy who also feels himself to be really always getting the short end of the stick and caught in a corrupt system. So there's a important relationship between the downfall of the age of the experts and the institutions that accredit experts, and the rise of the age of the guru.
I was thinking about, like, I was a reporter in an earlier life, and I had the good fortune to be in Boston for Barack Obama's famous 2004, keynote. And I was sitting, kind of quietly, not expecting that much, wasn't sure, eager to hear what a state senator from Illinois would have to say. And it was just electrifying, but it was just this broader narrative of there isn't red America or blue America, or there's just the United States of America, and weaving his story into a broader story of we are one nation. So, I mean, I think that, I mean, it was, I believe, a really compelling narrative. Of course, he becomes president. The financial crisis, raises lots of profound questions about whether we are one America. And then fast forward a couple of years later, I, as a reporter, attended Donald Trump's first inauguration talking about, the culture of carnage. And it was, wow, we have traveled a long distance in a short period of time.
And I guess it's worth remembering how close Trump's 2016 election was. And so historians, I think, struggle. Um, it's important to not, be too extreme, I suppose, in forecasting the doom and the death of the narrative that Barack Obama stood for, because that victory in 2016 was a fairly close run thing, and there are always kind of multiple contesting pictures of the country, and I think historians, we do have the temptation, in retrospect to interpret history in a way that suggests that the rise of Trump was an absolute foregone conclusion. And you're right to kind of highlight that might be a hazard.
Yeah. I want to read a couple sentences you write that I think is really important about understanding gurus and Trump more broadly. And you say spellbinding speeches mattered less in the age of cable news, sound bites, and social media. By transforming Twitter into his personal grievance platform, Trump supplied journalists and supporters with a stream of commentary that he could control more effectively than a conventional press conference. Even if he played fast and loose with the facts, his supporters took his unfiltered, knee-jerk communication style as proof that he was genuine. And I wonder if we could talk for a second about just the notion of kind of the medium of communication and how that interacts with charisma, because the tools that were available to FDR, in terms of radio were really important, TV for Kennedy and Reagan, and then social media for Trump. And any one of those people, with maybe a different technology might not have been as charismatic to the broad public.
Over the course of my research, I concluded that effective use, if not mastery, of the most powerful mass media technology of your era is a necessary but not sufficient condition for building a mass charismatic movement. But so it is something that you see all the way down the line, from Joseph Smith's use of print media to FDR's, masterful radio fireside chats, all the way to our own time. I am, though, pushing back against what I see as a tendency in our efforts to kind of make sense of our own era to exaggerate the degree to which we are different from eras in the past by virtue of having the internet and social media, and that somehow is this chasm that separates true modernity from everyone who came before. Because I do see so many of the kind of abiding impulses and hungers that really are the drivers of these charismatic movements. I see so much continuity between the 21st century and 17th century Puritans. And in understanding our most recent chapter, many of the features of our modern media and political landscape, they predate the internet. And even to just understand the most recent chapter, I think you go back to the 1990s and the rise of Rush Limbaugh, who of course is operating prior to the advent of the internet, but it is pioneering in that era a kind of the fracturing of the media landscape that both casts older mainstream institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post as peddlers of left-wing ideas, but also compels those mainstream outlets in reaction against the attack they're suffering to in fact, I think, politicize more than they had in prior generations. And all of those dynamics are unfolding without the internet, but then of course they get supercharged by the internet. And then there's this particular power that I think Trump has capitalized on in social media as a way of convincing his followers that they have kind of unmediated access to his stream of consciousness. And this taps into another theme in my book, which is the kind of rise of the cult of authenticity and our cultural obsession. It has some precursors before the 60s, but really kind of gains cultural momentum in the 60s, with authenticity as both the thing that we should all be seeking as kind of ultimate, to use the language of 1960s humanist psychology, self-actualization, but also, it emerges as this major criteria we should use to evaluate politicians, even when, it is often the result of kind of performance or at least strategic self-presentation. But authenticity has kind of become the substitute for factual truth, right? It's the thing we value much more than, whether Donald Trump cites his sources properly. At least among his supporters, this is the case. But it's, of course, not the same thing as truth.
Molly, what do you think the relationship is and between statesmanship and charisma? And I mean, clearly not all statesmen and stateswomen are charismatic. Not all charismatic people are statesmen and stateswomen. What is the relationship? And I'm thinking just in terms of our particular missions of teaching students, should we urge them to cultivate charisma? Is that something, should they see that as a tool, or is this something that you either have or you don't have? It's not something that could or should be cultivated.
Leadership studies programs and business schools especially have been trying to teach charisma for a generation now. So something that I learned a lot about in the book. There's no doubt that the art of crafting a charismatic narrative can be a great asset to someone who'd seek to lead a business or become a successful politician or religious leader. And to some degree, I think it can be learned. If a part of crafting a narrative that invites people in a persuasive way involves becoming a close student of the cultural situation and understanding the ways in which the current stories on offer in your culture are leaving some people very frustrated and alienated. At the same time, I would never conflate charisma with statesmanship. And I mean, as you note, there have been plenty of leaders who are deeply effective as people who claim their authority from institutions and are fairly content with a public image that is not one that kind of lofts their personality above everything else, but rather posits them as servants of the institution or of the government. I do think, though, that is not, if you're trying to turn a cultural tide, resurrect a company from the brink of bankruptcy, or defeat another political party that seems to be on the ascent, it's hard to do it by simply making a pitch for how great rules are. And we saw this, I think, in the 2024 presidential election, when, so many Democrats thought, boy, aren't enough Americans worried about the institutions of democracy, the integrity of our elections, the rule of law? Like, won't those basic values propel the Democrats to victory here? And the obvious answer is no, right? It's very hard to get people excited about rules and institutions, especially when the experience of the average American with bureaucracy and institutions and any kind of face of the government is almost always negative. I think for the purposes of winning an election, the art of charismatic storytelling is a crucial one. If it never by itself is a recipe for actually being a successful leader, I think that requires much less glamorous work.
I'm thinking we have an award for statesmanship in state and local government that we did with former Governor Jim Edgar. And we had a recent winner who's from maybe a community you've heard of, Ottawa, Illinois, not too far south. And this gentleman was a mayor for 20 years. He was quiet, painfully understated, modest, but he rebuilt the community. He forged relationships and got people excited and worked on beautification and floodplain development and so forth. And it was just it was an example of just sort of statesmanship at a really high level in a small community, but without sort of the kind of the excitement of charisma. And so I wonder if maybe some of it is just kind of a scale that the maybe the charisma of competence that he displayed in a small town of 18,000 in Illinois, or is appreciated in that community, but maybe would not translate into a national campaign or something.
That makes sense, especially when you think about the power of his competence. We can understand it in the within the boundaries of the community of people actively affected by his ability to solve practical problems. But the more you kind of zoom out, that competence can only touch so many people, and at a certain point, you need the story that you can turn into memes on TikTok or any of the other acids of our civilization.
Molly, final two questions. One, do you have another book in mind? I know that's a horrible thing to ask an author who has just spent 10 years of her life on a remarkable book. Is there something else in train, or are you going to just take some time to reflect and
Right now, I'm mainly working on shorter newspaper articles and things. I might take on a big narrative history of the human quest for eternal life from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Silicon Valley.
I look forward to that book. Let me ask you finally, this is a fun question I like to ask people. If North Carolina were to give you a 6 month sabbatical with the only instruction is to read good books, where would you be likely to go? Are there some classics that you've never gotten to, classics you'd like to reread, or just a whole area of sort of the human experience that you just don't know that much about, but you sort of catch yourself thinking, gosh, I'd love to spend some time learning about, fill in the blank.
Boy, I would, I guess my mind immediately goes to a kind of monastic retreat in which I would fill the many gaps in my in my reading in the great spiritual classics of not just Christianity but other world religions. So I think I'd want to spend some time. I mean, I know the Christian tradition by far the best, but have much to read, especially among the early church fathers. But I would want, and the part of my thinking with this next big book project is that it would give me an excuse to really plunge into some of the ancient spiritual classics of the Hindu and Buddhist traditions.
Great, great. Well, Molly, thank you for such a generous amount of your time. Thank you for writing a really terrific book called Spellbound that I would urge everyone who's interested in leadership and America and even world history to understand. It's such an kind of a creative way and a thoughtful and rigorous way of understanding this concept and explaining it to us and getting us thinking about it. So, Molly, thank you so much for your time. We may have to find a way to coax you to Carbondale. I don't know there's another forensics contest, but maybe we can find another way to bring you down here to speak with students and see this part of the state, which, as you know, is very different than other parts of Illinois.
Well, thanks so much, and I really appreciated this conversation.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series. We will have this interview with Molly, a link to it on our website in the next couple days. Please share it with family and friends. I urge you to take a careful look at this book. I think you'll find it really rewarding. And again, thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.